How did General Vandegrift and the US 1st Marine Division defend the decisive terrain of Henderson Airfield after the Battle of Alligator Creek? We'll look at the Tanambogo raid and the preparations for the Battle of Edson's Ridge.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Principles of War. This episode, number 139, is Edson's Ridge Part 1, Vandegrift's Perimeter and Kawaguchi's Plan. I'm joined once again with our expert on the Guadalcanal campaign, Dave Holland, and he is going to step us through the lead up to one of the main battles in the Guadalcanal campaign, Edson's Ridge, or as it is sometimes known, Bloody Ridge. There's a lot to cover today, so let's get right into the episode. Welcome back to the podcast, Dave.
Oh, it's great to be back, James. I'm really looking forward to this one again. Once again, we're on the ground, and today's Edson's Ridge or Bloody Ridge, so it's a great battle to study.
It is a really important battle. So after the Battle of the Tenaroo, what was the situation for the Marines?
So after the Battle of Tenaroo, so they'd actually, as we discussed last week, they took out basically a reinforced battalion in Chiki, so they knew that their first attempt to take the island had been defeated. They was still, Vandegrift was still thinking about an amphibious assault to his front. I think I failed to mention last week when the Chiki attacked that Vandegrift initially thought it was a diversionary attack and they were about to get hit in the front or on the beach by amphibious assault. But that didn't occur, as we know. But they were still preparing for that. So the threat to the Marine perimeter was to the front and to the flanks, just like it was previous to Alligator Creek. So they were preparing for a second counterattack because they thought, well, the Japanese hit us with the land counterattack. They didn't take the airfield, so obviously they want the airfield back, so let's just prepare as best we can. So they went about fortifying their positions. At that stage, as we know, the Cactus Air Force had landed. The Cactus Air Force being the code word for Guadalcanal's Cactus, and the two Marine squadrons were there, and other air was coming in. The U.S. Army started landing their P-400s, a squadron, the 67th Fighter Squadron had landed, and they started beefing up the air power. So preparing the defenses more. The flanks and the front was his main threat, but the rear was open. He didn't have enough troops to do a 360-degree perimeter. So the way they covered their rear, so to speak, was to form outposts on the ridges by small squads. And the areas between the outposts was roving patrols. The units they used to man these outposts was like the 1st Amphibious Tractor Battalion, the 1st Engineer Battalion, the 1st Pioneer Battalion. So during the day, these guys would be doing their engineering task or whatever, and at night, they'd go man their post. So the whole rear was vulnerable to Vandegrift. So they were waiting. Turner had promised the supplies are going to come back, that we will return. We don't abandon you, we will return. So by the 21st, some of the supplies started coming in. They started running the fast destroyer, APD destroyers I had. They were running trips to New Caledonia and doing loads, small loads. Let's say, for example, they'd bring in enough supplies for, say, 2 days of food, and they'd bring ammunition in. And then they started bringing in some of the bombs and some of the fuel and things like that. And then I think toward the end of August, you started seeing the R4Ds, which is the C-47s, the Army called them, the Marines and Navy called them R4D, the cargo planes. Cargo planes started coming in, and they were doing daily runs, or almost daily runs, and they would come in, drop off a limited amount of supplies, because obviously they can't carry that much, but they'd drop off stuff like aviation fuel, medicine, even mail. But they were starting to do those supply runs, and then on the way back, they would take wounded, and that was some of the medical evacuations. Because of the hospital in Guadalcanal, even though there was a 1st Medical Battalion, it was limited in what it could do. I mean, obviously, it could stabilize a Marine or a Navy enough to get them on an airplane and go back to New Caledonia to a larger hospital. And then if they needed to, they'd go into New Zealand or Australia or back to the States. So that was how the Marines were preparing after the Battle of Alligator Creek.
So it's an interesting point in the campaign. So the US Navy has largely ceded sea control at night to the Imperial Japanese Navy, allowing the Tokyo Expresses to run. What was the logistics situation for the IJA and the Marines?
Well, just like I touched on there with the Marines, the U.S. Navy were bringing in some supplies, limited amount of supplies. There were some transports getting through, but it wasn't full-on supply runs. But the supply line wasn't cut off. I'll just say that much. The Japanese, even though they controlled the night, didn't ring the island, didn't blockade the island. They controlled the night, as in the fact they could bring their ships unimpeded and drop off their own supplies and drop off their own soldiers. But there wasn't a blockade on the island. So the Americans were getting supplies in. It wasn't as much as they wanted, but there's small amounts. So the supply line was dribbling in. The issue the Americans had, one of the major issues, was back in New Caledonia. Because you remember, New Caledonia wasn't a major supply hub from the very beginning. So they had supplies being built up. They had supplies on ships waiting to offload. So it was like a big bottleneck in New Caledonia. They couldn't offload. They had the ships to move to Guadalcanal, but there was a big stopgap there. The wharfs wasn't large enough. They didn't have facilities to put the supplies. They did offload. Didn't have enough men to offload it with the stevedores. So that was the whole supply situation was unorganized. You had Navy supply, Army supply, and they wasn't mixing. It was non-coordinated. So that was a big holdup. And some people, when they think about the supply issues, don't think about these specific islands at the very beginning, the infrastructure in place. Obviously, you've got Wellington, New Zealand, and a number of ports in Australia, but most of the other islands didn't have the facilities to take in the impact. And plus, New Caledonia was Vichy French. And I was reading a point where the Americans had to share one of their main docks with the Vichy French commercial ships because that was the deal. They didn't want to create waves down there. So that was the Americans' logistical supplies. Once again, they're down to 2 meals a day. The two reasons for that: one, they wanted to ration their supplies, and two, the noontime runs for the bomber runs from Rabaul came about 11 and 12, 1 o'clock. And then the Marines didn't eat around that time because they're in the holds because that was called condition black. That means bombers are overhead. So what they used to do is 2 meals a day. They'd eat one in the morning, one late in the afternoon, maybe some coffee or something in midday, or maybe a little snack or whatever, chocolate bar if they had one of those D-ration chocolate bar. So they were between the supplies they offloaded and the Japanese rations. They had enough to last at least 30 days, 60 days. And then once again, the transports were coming in, dropping like 2 days off of food and things like that. So they wasn't doing without no food. Yeah, they were hungry, but they wasn't doing without. They had plenty of ammunition, and including artillery ammunition. And all that was coming in too. So say, for example, a supply run for a destroyer could drop off 11,000 rounds of 81 millimeter mortars in one hit. So yeah, there was a lot of supplies coming in. The Japanese, well, both forces are running into the end of their logistical supply lines anyway. So it's a great study on logistics in the Guadalcanal campaign. So the Japanese, what we discussed last week, was just scrambling to get land forces there to react. So the land forces that they actually dropped off didn't have a limited amount of supplies because they were using fast destroyers and some cargo ships. Now, the Battle of Easter Solomons was fought in late August. The Japanese were going to use cargo ships or transport ships during the day to offload more supplies and more troops. But then the Battle of Easter Solomons occurred, and around that time, some of the Marine SBD dive bombers from Henderson hit a transport and sunk one and pushed the other ones back. So that was Ichiki's second echelon he's supposed to wait on. Well, they got turned back due to the Cactus Air Force. And that word got back to the Japanese. They said, well, we can't offload a lot of supplies and a lot of troops during the day. We got to put them on these fast destroyer runs and do it at night. So that kind of hampered or hamstrung their supply issues too, because at this stage, we're getting both sides bringing in supplies, but only limited due to the fact that they had to put them on destroyers, fast destroyers, which had a limited cargo capacity running at night. So yeah, it was a very unique situation.
One of the problems that the Marines had to contend with was dysentery within the perimeter. So I think they were up to about 20% of the Marines had been affected with dysentery.
Yeah, so sickness started coming around. You got to remember, they're all packed in that small perimeter. A lot of the Marines were green. They were just learning about sanitary conditions, even though some of the NCOs and officers knew about it the best they could. But a lot of the Marine junior NCOs and junior officers and Marines were, for example, they'd throw the trash and they didn't dig proper latrines and, like they should have, which would cause dysentery, or not washing their plates correctly. You'd have the big, they call them GI cans, which is a big galvanized garbage cans full of boiling water. Some of the privates and, soldiers and Marines they get lazy if you don't, supervise them. So they weren't washing their plates properly. Once again, that could cause this, and then it spread. Now, malaria was a big impact throughout the campaign, and we'll see. But this stage, malaria really hadn't kicked in because, as you probably know, James, malaria takes a few weeks to really, really kick in for a bulk kick in. I mean, a few people can get it after maybe a week or two, but generally it doesn't really start impacting until, I'm not a medical guy, but I know that I live in Guadalcanal for 3 years, so I know all about malaria and try to avoid it and everything. So it generally kicks in about, I think, 12 days. Don't quote me on that, but it isn't instant, say, for example, like dysentery. So that really hadn't kicked in yet. But yeah, they were starting to suffer the tropical sickness and lethargy. They're getting lethargic, wearing out. You were in Guadalcanal for a week, and with that heat, humidity, it starts sapping your strength even after a week. When you were in nice air conditioning, we're drinking the beers, it cooling down every night and all that. But just imagine if you're living in those conditions. And once again, it goes back to one of the first episodes. When the Marines offloaded, they didn't have tents. They cut that back due to weight. So most of the guys on the front line, like the infantry guys, were living in holes with a poncho over the top as cover. And you can imagine, by this stage, we're talking 3 weeks or into 4 weeks into camp, a month on the island already. In early September, they had the great Guadalcanal housing boom. So all these shanty towns and shanties just started coming up everywhere. Any spare wood and tarps, they started making their little huts and hooches out, but still living in those conditions. That we're starting to get the sickness.
So we've got two commanders who are going to be fighting this battle. We've got Kawaguchi and Lieutenant Colonel Merit Red Mike Edson. Kawaguchi, he's the commander of the 35th Infantry Brigade.
Yeah.
What was he like? What's his story? What sort of commander was he?
So of all of the generals, I think Japanese had something like 7 or 8 generals that was in the whole Guadalcanal campaign, not including the ones that visited. I consider him the best of the bunch. Major General Kayotaki, probably mispronouncing that or butchering that, but Kayotaki Kawaguchi. So Kawaguchi, once again, he graduated from the Japanese Imperial Academy like they all do, like they're over the West Point or Sandhurst, or Duntrum, if you want to say Australia. So it went through that, staff positions, had done his time in service in China during the China Wars. So he did some combat command. When the war broke out, he was in charge of the 35th Brigade, which his core unit was 124th Regiment. So they participated in the Borneo campaign. He got all around Borneo, and they used barges. And he was very proficient in barges, and they used them to a great extent. Just small. When I say barges, when I say barge, it isn't like a traditional river barge you might have in your head. See, Japanese barges are like the little Daihatsu landing craft. They had the ramps where the U.S. Marines got their idea for a Higgins boat with a ramp on the front, watching the little Japanese Daihatsu landing crafts in the 30s when they were in China. But yeah, it was a combination of those and some other boats. That was what they called the barges. And they would get around and offload on those. So all around that campaign, especially won the Borneo campaign. What was the place? Sandakan, where the Australians, they killed all the POWs. Sandakan?
Oh yeah, the march. Yes, yep.
Yeah. So they went to there too. I remember they took Sandakan. They weren't responsible for that, but yeah, that was tragic. Anyway, and then he went to the Philippines for garrison duties in Cebu, I think. So in Philippines, this is where it became a bit controversial. Kawaguchi. So he got there, and he was ordered to kill the Filipino Supreme Court justices and other government officials in the area. He refused. He says, "Well, this isn't shooting unarmed men." Is not the traditional Bushido code. He was real. I think he has to come from a samurai family, long line tradition. He says it's not traditional Bushido to kill innocents like this. Anyway, the powers that be, his high command, didn't like that one bit. So after that, I think he wasn't ostracized, but I think he was. I can't really find any evidence of that. There's suggestions that he was ostracized. He was sent to Guadalcanal to die, which I don't find any evidence of that. I think it's just a bit of hyperbole. But anyway, his unit was picked to lead the assault and Operation FX, which is the invasion of Fiji and Samoa and New Caledonia. They were going to be the assault unit. So it doesn't seem to me that if you're going to be the assault unit, you wouldn't pick your B team to be the main assault, just like Ichiki was going to hit and his unit was going to hit Midway. You're not going to pick your worst guys, and you're going to send them to die just to do that, because obviously you're counting on success. But after that was canceled, then he was slated to, they went back to Rabaul. Oh, sorry, they went to Palo. The Palos, around where Peleliu is. And then they were slated to go to the 17th Army under Haikataki. They were going to participate in the New Guinea campaign. Don't quote me on this, but I think they were slated to go into Milne Bay. I know they were going to hit Port Moresby at one stage, but they were definitely going into the campaign under Haikataki. So yeah, he was the best. He wasn't rash. He liked the plan, as we'll see. The troops liked him. He was very, he led from the front too. So he seemed like a pretty good commander. He was very switched on in how his thinking was. He wasn't as rash as a cheat.
So what do we know about Merritt Edson?
All right, so yeah, Colonel Merritt Edson, or Red Mike as they called him. Yeah, so he'd missed the Great War. He went in at the very end in the occupation in Germany. And then he went to Nicaragua. And there he was in the combat roles in Nicaragua, an admin role or advisory role. It kind of was, but it also was. He definitely went into combat patrols. He was an avid shooter, captain of the Marine Corps national shooting teams for years, distinguished marksman. Pretty small guy, pretty reserved. He didn't suffer fools type of commander. He only picked it, basically if you knew what you got with Edson, and he respected competence. If he wasn't competent, he'd kick you out of his unit, and he'd always led by example. He was very, very smart tactician, especially operational tactician. Yeah, very quiet too. But they said you never got on his wrong side. I think somebody said he had cold stone killer eyes. So yeah, probably not a commander you want to get in trouble and be standing at attention in front of his desk to get your butt chewed out. So yeah, great guy.
So what was the intelligence picture for both sides before the battle?
So the Marines, they had their Solomon Island scouts running patrols. It's like we discussed, I think, last time. Their patrols mainly ran to the east due to the fact that a lot of these local scouts came from that area, and they knew the area quite well. They could use the villages. The Marines had two lookouts, very fancy intelligence lookout posts. It's just like two big tree houses, one to the left of the perimeter, one to the right. And they called it lookout left and lookout right. And that's what they were. They're like giant tree houses with the spotting scopes, with radio in it, field phone. And that was what they were using. And then once the air came, they started using them to do reconnaissance flights, mainly to look for ships coming in. And then you had coast watchers, obviously, running up and down up in the Solomon Chains, giving information coming back about oncoming ships and oncoming planes. And then once again, you had Project Magic, or Ultra, which is the breaking of Japanese codes and radio signals that was really coming in. There's only, as far as I know, there was about 4 men in the whole division that saw those any transmissions. And it was the only transmissions that the Naval Intelligence at Pearl Harbor wanted them to see. So Vandegrift, his chief of staff, Thomas Twining, and I think the Seneca, who was the colonel, he was the lieutenant, he was the division's comms officer, because he was the ones that interpreted or processed it. Yeah, so that was really the only intelligence. And then the Marines started running patrols out. Patrols would go and gather intelligence. At this stage, because of the lack of skills in the patrolling skills in the division. So this comes after Bloody Ridge, and we'll talk about that, about the patrolling skills. But yeah, that was how they were getting their intel. Japanese nailed it on August. I think I mentioned last time how the garrison was without a radio. So, and they had been wiped out on the first Tanambogo, and there was a few of them left. So I think on the August the 14th to 15th, right before they got wiped out, the Japanese landed 113 Special Naval Landing Force, the first reinforcements the Japanese landed, but they had a radio with them. That was one of the main reasons. So they met up with Captain Monson, the garrison commander, and they started sending some reports back. Not much. Aerial reconnaissance was flying over. You still had the Japanese submarines popping up and doing some reconnaissance work there. But the Japanese were still kind of running in the blind, especially with the numbers of Marines there. They knew the Marines were probably going to stay now. They were there to stay. Even though that Ichiki's 28th Regiment, or his first detachment had been wiped out, the general consensus still reckoned there were about 3,000 Marines still there, because they hadn't seen too much reinforcements or withdrawals. They still reckoned that they're sticking with a number about 3,000. And you will see that number is going to change when Kawaguchi. That was the intel Kawaguchi got. But once Kawaguchi landed on the island, he thought it was probably about 7,000 due to a convoy of transports. He said a convoy, which was a couple of destroyers and a transport. But he said, they've been beefed up. He thought there was anywhere between 4 to 5. But then he's seen that he reckons about 7,000 on the island. So, but yeah, there was basically stabbing in the dark with a reconnaissance.
So Vandegrift is in command. He's responsible for the defence of Henderson Airfield. What was his plan to defend the airfield?
Yeah, I think it's like I said earlier. He'd beefed up his beach defences more because they expected that was where the main assault was going to hit at Lunga Point. Strengthened the flanks because obviously he'd been hit already on his right flank at Alligator Creek. And then the rear, which is less susceptible, he was using the jungle to his advantage. He said any attack through the jungle, that's my least threatened area, hopefully would cause attrition to any unit that attacked me. Plus, I'll cover that area with roving patrols and some outposts on key points, key ridges. And he'd ring the inner perimeter was completely covered by his artillery. And he had his 2 tank companies. At that stage, the 1st Marine Tank Battalion only had 2 companies, A and B company. So he had those guys in the middle, roughly around the airfield, for a quick counterattack force. So they were digging in and waiting for the eventual large Japanese counterattack that would come.
So he wasn't really expecting... So Edson's Ridge is to the south of Henderson Field, about 1,000 yards?
Yeah. So, the northern end of... So, it's about 1,100 yards from the airfield to the northern end. Depends on who's measuring it. But, roughly about that. So it's not that far.
So he's actually not expecting a significant attack through the jungle, up through that approach then?
No. He thought the threat would actually hit him on the front or the flanks. Because that was what they expected.
So what units did he have up on Edson's Ridge?
We didn't have any unit on Edson's Ridge. The only unit, I guess you could say, I mentioned earlier, was the engineers had a small outpost, a squad size. And that wouldn't man 24/7 there. They're doing their engineering duties. They were very close to there. They were building Fighter Field 1 at the time. And it was kind of at the base. It's between Edson's Ridge or Bloody Ridge and Henderson. They're building Fighter 1 at the time. So, they probably had a few guys up there on outpost duty, but during the night had roughly a squad size. And across the Lunga River on the ridges there, they had some of the amphibious tractor guys and some of the pioneers. But there were anyone on there. But on my date's right, I think on around the 9th, maybe even 8th or 9th of September, the 1st Marine Division command post, when they initially landed, was near the Lunga River, between Henderson and Lunga River, tucked in on a nice coral ledge, tucked in on the leeward side, the inside for non-naval speaking people. I'll probably get it wrong anyway. Not the windward side, not the seaside, due to the fact that they thought any naval gunfire that ridge would protect them. It would from naval gunfire, but it didn't protect them from the Tojo time, they call it, which is the daily Betty bombers from 20,000 feet trying to blast the airfield. Any bombs dropped short would hit the command post. And the Marines started calling it the V ring. So the Marine bullseye target in those days had a V ring on it, like, hit the bullseye. So they were the bullseye. So Vandegrift says, this is not conducive to our operation, to getting bombed every day. So let's just move up on this nice ridge about 1,000 yards south, which is, to me, it's in the back of away from everything. And it's a nice tucked away place there. And we're not going to get hit every day. So they picked up shop, moved everything up on the ridge, on Bloody Ridge, which is later be known as Bloody Ridge or Edson's Ridge. So the 1st Marine Division had moved up on Edson's Ridge, up on the northern end of Edson's Ridge, on a nice spur. And they tucked in on the ravine all around that. Now, some of them are on top, most of them are down into the ravine on the reverse slopes, or whichever, front slope, reverse slope, wherever you look at it. Yeah, and they engineers built a nice little hut for Vandegrift. It had his room on one end, had his chief of staff on the other end, had a nice meeting in the middle. So there was a nice little area they'd built there. That's the only people at this stage. And he had some of his security companies and stuff, and whatever you think of a division command post. So there were a few guys up there. Division headquarters company.
Do you want to just talk us through the terrain of Edson's Ridge? You've been there multiple times.
I still reckon, I counted up one time, just an estimate. I've probably walked that ridge over 300 times. I used to go there after work every day. Right? And on Sunday mornings, I used to go up there and read sometimes. It's a very peaceful place. I'd go do my jungle walks, researching all by myself, and then come back up on the ridge and just covered with sweat, and find a nice little shady spot with the wind blowing on the sea breeze. And sometimes I'd get a book on Bloody Ridge or Edson's Ridge, and I'd go sit in a hole there in a foxhole and just read about it, which is pretty cool. Yeah, so the ridge is about 1,100 yards long, north to south or south to north, however you want to look at it. It's probably, to put it in a listener or viewer's mind, the Japanese call it a centipede. That's what their nickname for the ridge was, a centipede. So imagine a curvy ridge, and along the spine of the ridge, there's spurs running off on both sides. There's like 3 or 4 good spurs, and those spurs are even roughly on each side. Hence, looking like a centipede with its legs out, multiple legs. And that's what it looks like. So, typical of the coral ridges on Guadalcanal, the ridges were bare. They're kunai grass covered with coral. Topsoil on the tops could be inches to maybe half a foot. So, it's not much to dig in. The ravines below were thick jungle. So, it's a natural avenue of approach to the airfield if you're coming out of that jungle. Well, it was picked, and we'll talk about that a bit later. Oh, and the height, I'm going to try to convert it to meters, but the height ran from the southern end at 90 feet to hill 2, 120 feet, to I think another 100 feet. So roughly 90 to 120 feet. So it wasn't that high, but as you've been there, the sides on most of it are very steep sides. So it'd be hard for an attacker to try to get up there.
So looking at Kawaguchi, what was his march to his forming up points like, and what was his plan of attack?
Kawaguchi basically said, I'm not going to be as rash as Ichiki. I think words to that effect. He said something like that. We know a lot about what Kawaguchi was thinking because there was a Japanese reporter embedded in with his unit, and he wrote his dispatches. And he didn't stay on Guadalcanal. He left probably a month later. But anyway, he got back and he had his dispatches. And I think, I haven't seen it yet. I've seen excerpts of it. Kawaguchi wrote some memoirs after the war. And they're similar to me. They're fairly non-biased. They're ejectable. It's not like a lot of these autobiographies on some of these generals. It's all about me and I'll never make mistakes. But I think he's pretty good. I like to read it all, trying to get it. So his plan was complex. It was a complex plan. It was a sound plan on paper, but with a few moving parts. Well, in fact, a lot of moving parts. It would take a lot of coordination to make it happen. So Kawaguchi's brigade, he had about 6,500 guys. And he had arrived his forces started arriving between the 30th of August and like the around the 30th, 4th of September. And they were landing on the eastern side, roughly around the same area where Ichiki had landed. So, like I said before, with Eastern Solomons, Kawaguchi was a big guy with the barges for Borneo, right? He wanted to run everything on barges. And him and I forgot the Japanese admiral, had a bit of an argument. They said, look, we just fought Battle of Eastern Solomons. Kawaguchi said, we'll take transports in. I'll take my whole force in. He goes, well, these transports are going to get sunk. American Air Force are going to sink us. So I think you had 7 fast destroyers. We'll put you in these 7 fast destroyers from Truk. No, some are from Rabaul, that stage at Rabaul. And we're doing night runs. And they did. They did night runs over 3 or 4 days. And they dropped Kawaguchi. And about, I think, roughly 4,000 men to the East Coast. Now, we got to remember, you got these guys, second echelon at Ichiki, right? They're there now. They've landed around the same time. They were delayed, and now they jumped on with Kawaguchi, and they're landing. So they've landed now, and they've got some heavy weapons. They've got some anti-tank guns. They've got some 70-millimeter guns. I think they got some 75-millimeter mountain guns. So they've teamed up with Kawaguchi. So that's the second echelon at Ichiki. So Kawaguchi's got a force in that area, roughly about, I'd say, 4,000. All the difference between 38 and 4,000. So they're on the East Coast. He'd broken up his units because Colonel Oka, I forgot Colonel Oka's first name, but Colonel Oka was the regimental commander of the 124th Regiment. So they were the core infantry unit of the 35th. So Oka and a battalion and the battalion's regimental headquarters went to the Shortland Islands, which is up to Solomon Chains, in these quote barges. And that's where they came in. So during the day, these barges would go from island to island. Sorry, at night, they'd move it island to island and island hopping down. So they could like hold up during the day and not get seen by the air. It took them a few days, but I think the night, or they got caught out on the day before they're about to land on the West Coast. They got shot up pretty good. American planes caught them out, killed a few of them. Not too many, but yeah, it caused a bit of mayhem. Anyway, they've landed. They've landed on the West Coast, which is going to be the traditional landing places the rest of the campaign. So you've got 2 Japanese forces on both sides. So what Kawaguchi's plan was he was going to, because the Kuma Battalion now, which is Ichiki guys, had the heavy weapons. They were going to move down, follow roughly the path that Ichiki did, and then he was going to start branching off. He was going to use the Kuma Battalion, which when I say Kuma, that was the first of the Ichiki guys. They didn't have to go far, but they were going to stage, and they were going to strike below Alligator Creek to the east, right? So they were going to strike in a holding attack or diversionary attack. Colonel Oka and his regiment, and one of the battalions of the 4th had landed by then and joined up with Kawaguchi. They were going to advance from the west and hit the Marines on the western perimeter, while Kawaguchi was going to branch off, go through the jungle, travel south, and then they saw that linear natural avenue of approach, and they knew by some of their scouts, because you got to remember, some of the garrison guys were still running around. They're from the original garrison, and they'd been given a bit of information, just like they gave it to Ichiki, they're giving it to Kawaguchi. And they knew if he brought all these guys out of that thick jungle, once they hit that linear approach to the airfield, you can see on the photograph, it's like a arrow, a straight line to the airfield. If they can come out of that jungle, that's a nice consolidation, coordination. They can just run straight down that ridge and just put a few thousand guys straight on that airfield very, very quick. And that was his plan. So it all had to be a coordinated assault, hit the Americans on the flanks, hold them, draw their attention with a main thrust coming from the south out of the jungle against, quote, an undefended ridge. And that was his plan. And it was a good plan on paper. Once again, very complex. And at the same time, he had requested for, prior to the assault, that bombing, Betty bombers, and naval gunfire support to prep the ridge before the assault.
So what sort of time frame are we looking then for the planning? So how many days did he have to get into position, or how long did he have to get into position, and how was he going to try and coordinate those? So effectively there's 3 attacks then, one from the east, one from the west, and Kawaguchi making the main assault up Edson's Ridge. How was he going to try and coordinate that?
Well, they had radios. The radios weren't that great, but they had the radios and had runners, actually. They were running back and forth. You wouldn't believe it, but they were. And he knew the delay of Oka was delayed because they got shot up in the barges, but Oka was en route, so he knew Oka was coming. Now, when they landed, or once again, I think once all his forces was together, about the 4th of September, they started doing their planning. It didn't take him long, and they're on the move. He's landed the 31st of August, not the 31st, so he started getting his planners together, getting the assessments. Wouldn't took him only that many days to come up with a plan. So he's on the move. I think by the 4th and 5th, he's on the move with the majority of his units. He's left a small rear guard at Taivu Point where they landed in that area, around Tanambogo, Taivu Point. He's on the move. And they're heading east at this stage toward the Marines. So they were going to use their radios and runners to coordinate the assaults. They had timings. Now, initially he said our assault's going to be on the 12th. I think it was 11th. I have to double check. But anyway, he said it was going to be on the 11th. He's requesting, and once they got into the jungle on the move, he says, I'm going to be a day late. So he requested permission from Rabaul. He goes, can I postpone it to the 12th? Instead of him saying, yes, you can postpone it to the 12th, they come back and go, no, we want you to attack like in 2 days. It's on the 9th. And I can probably hear him. He's going, hold on a minute. I'll just ask you I told you I can't make it. I'm asking for a day extension. Then he's come back and go, no, we want you to do it 2 days earlier. I mean, talking about cross communication. So anyway, I can't do that. Here's a factor that a lot of accounts don't bring in. It goes back to their hubris. Kind of is mirroring Ichiki a bit. The 4th Regiment was en route. In fact, Kawaguchi had the 2nd Battalion of the 4th attached to him for this assault. And another battalion of the 4th had landed roughly around the same time on the West Coast. And they're waiting for the other battalion and the headquarters. So they said to Kawaguchi, if you want to delay, even though they told him to attack, to wait for this other battalion, let us know. And Kawaguchi came back and goes, no, I've got enough. I've got roughly 6,500 guys. I've got enough to do this. So he waved it off. And this is at the very beginning on his march. And we'll see very shortly that he's requesting them for something to happen. He said, can you just send that in now? And that's a bit too late. But yeah, so he just waited off. So, we've got enough. Once again, overconfident.
It's interesting to see because it happens on both sides, that hubris.
Oh yeah. It's human nature, isn't it?
So how did the initial attack play out?
So once they got into the jungle, and Kawaguchi, they'd planned a night attack too, and he had actually told the reporter that a night attack is one of the hardest things they could do. But he thought that's obviously that's their bread and butter, attacking at night. Nobody using the infiltration tactics and all that. It turned into, I think Richard Frank called one of the biggest human traffic jams, because they're only using a few trails to get through. They're hacking their way through best they can. I read one account by I wouldn't call him a historian. This guy, he basically said they don't have one compass, and he said they didn't realize that Bloody Ridge was even there, which I thought, I'll quit reading and listening after that. It's like, yeah, okay, they got one compass for a whole brigade. It's like something they said in the movie 1941, with John Belushi and the boat crew. I've lost my compass. They get one out of Cracker Jack box. But yeah, so they did have some faulty compasses, and Americans did too. I'm writing my second book now in the U.S. Army, and they ran into faulty compasses. They were having some issues with the compasses at Gifu. And then the jungle itself, trying to hack through that, and then trying to find your bearings in that. And then you're getting, he's got 3,000 guys trying to push through that jungle, all maintain unit cohesion. So they just come and disperse, stragglers. At that stage, I mean, they're not starving or hungry. I won't say starving, they're not hungry or sick or anything. They're just having a hard time getting in position. Like I said, Kawaguchi had left his main supply base, his base of operations at Tavu Point and Tanambogo. So he left it there with a small rear guard and it's some of his 75 millimeter guns. So he's taking off right there, heading to do their attack. Some of the Solomon Island scouts under Martin Clemens, coast watcher. Well, he wasn't a coast watcher then. He was part of the division. Reports come in and saying, "Ooh, there's some Japanese at Tavu Point, and there's thousands of them." And the division goes, "Yeah, I don't think there's thousands." And they kind of said, "Okay, maybe they've seen a few stragglers from Ichiki, but there's probably nothing there." And then at that stage, they'd brought the Raiders, and the parachute battalion was attached to the Raiders, and they'd brought them over from Tulagi, so they're back on Guadalcanal at this stage. So Colonel Edson, the battalion commander for this combined battalion, was listening in on this about the information coming in, and he suggested to the chief of staff, he goes, we're Raiders, let us do a raid, and there we can gather some intelligence. If there's apparently all these Japanese there and all this big supply base, let's just go and see. And they said, "Oh, that's a good idea." So early in the morning on the 8th of September, he took, I think, 2 companies, reinforced companies, and they landed at Tanambogo. And when they landed, they said, "Bang, we've got a major supply base here." Some of the Japanese there ran off because they thought it was a major invasion. And then they came back, and there was a bit of a firefight. And they used a 75 millimeter, and they fired a couple of rounds to Marines. But anyway, they killed most of the Japanese, and the other ones that fled in the jungle. But all the supplies they found there, obviously, they stuck their pockets full of food and beer, whatever they could get. They took some of the 75 millimeters and 37 millimeter anti-tank guns and hooked cables to them with a landing craft and drug them out to sea. And, they urinated on the rice bags. And while all this was happening, there was a correspondent named Richard Tregaskis, and he wrote Guadalcanal Diary, a famous book. It later became a movie. But Tregaskis and all these Marine Raiders were going crazy, eating all this stuff and tearing everything up, kids in a candy shop. He goes, "Ooh." He grabbed the blanket and started throwing these papers. He says, "I'm going to start gathering intelligence." It was a civilian guy. He's the one that switched on enough to start gathering all this intelligence. Anyway, he's grabbed a blanket full of papers he could throw in there. They did their raid and they booked back. So the importance of this, when they got back, Division, Vandegrift and the rest of them, we had confirmation, and they counted life jackets, they counted boats, and they reckoned there was about at least 4,000 Japanese coming their way, which is very accurate. And they said it's a fresh unit, and they're coming our way. They captured Kawaguchi's uniform, the radios and all kinds of stuff. The long-range radio, they destroyed it. So they came back and said, "Vandegrift, look, this is Edson and the chief of staff." They said, "We've got these thousands of Japanese coming this way." So Vandegrift says, "They're probably going to hit us on the flank, same place they hit us Alligator Creek." But Edson and Thomas looked at the map, looked at the situation, and said, "If I was a Japanese general, this is why I'd come. I'd hit us here. I'd come out of the jungle. I'd go straight down this ridge and hit us here." So it's a great plan. Vandegrift was still on, and he goes, "I don't know." But then they approached the commander from a different angle. They said, "Look, the Raiders have been having it tough here lately. We've got them down near the airfield. Can we just move them up on the ridge for a bit of a rest area? And plus, they can serve as your division CP security." So that's the way they sold it to the old man, was the way they said it. So Vandegrift said, yeah, that's a good idea. So the raiders, they started moving their way up and to a rest area. One of the raiders, in his memoirs, he said, yeah, that lasted about 3 hours. As we get up there, they got, all right, start digging in, start moving stuff, doing all this. They go, some effing, rest area this is. But they started fortifying the area. Now, when I'm saying fortified, you got to remember, they only offloaded 28 spools of barbed wire. So they had limited amount of barbed wire to put up there. So like I said, the ridge, car ridge, can't really dig in there. And plus they didn't have nothing to dig with. They had limited amount of digging tools. They didn't have any major entrenching kits they offloaded. They just had a few shovels and they scraped holes. I mean, if you look at the pictures of Edson's Ridge the day after the battle, there's great photos and they just shows just shell scraping, just like they call them ranger graves in America, just like scrapes. They're not fixed on barbed wire and fixed holes and all that. Anyone that goes to Edson's Ridge now, there's still barbed wire there, but that's from when the 7th Marines came in and built that area up in late September, early October. They had hardly any defenses, and we'll talk about defenses a bit later. But yeah, so they knew there was all these thousands of guys heading their way. So once they started fortifying the best way they could, they started sending out patrols. Edson started sending out long, like huge patrols south to try to find out what's going on. And then the scouts, Solomon Island scouts, started trying to find these guys too. So, but that goes back now. Once they're up on the 12th, this is the 12th of September. Remember I said that Kawaguchi wanted a preliminary bombardment. So every day hits the airfield at 12 o'clock, 11, 12 o'clock. So that day, around 11 or 12 o'clock, the Marines were spread out on Edson's Ridge watching here comes the bombs again. But this day they were flying a bit different pattern. They're going, what the hell's going on here? And they dropped a bunch of daisy cutters along the ridge, killed 2 raiders and wounded several others. So that was another indication to the Marine intelligence is, this wasn't these are daisy cutter bombs. This isn't designed for dropping on airfields. And plus 2, they flew a different pattern. This just wasn't a mistake. They meant to prep this area. So obviously something's going to happen. This is the day of the 12th.
We're going to leave the story here. It is the 12th of September. The Battle of Edson's Ridge is just about to start. A big thank you again to Dave Holland. You can just tell all of that expertise that he's got. He's really bringing this campaign to life, and he's helping us to understand so many of the lessons that come out of this littoral campaign. In my mind, there's a few points that come out of this that are really important to understand the importance of this battle. Firstly, Vandegrift has made his assessment that the airfield is the decisive terrain on Guadalcanal. It is not key terrain, which is any locality or area, the seizure or retention of which affords a marked advantage to either combatant. No, the airfield at Henderson is much more important than that. Decisive terrain is terrain that may have an extraordinary impact on the outcome of the operation. The designation of decisive terrain implies that the success of the operation depends on the seizure or retention of the terrain. When we look at the naval campaign and the conduct of air operations from the Cactus Airfield, we are going to see just how important the conduct of those air operations were. The retention of the airfield for the Marines enabled flight operations from Henderson Airfield by the Cactus Air Force. On some days, there weren't that many aircraft in the Cactus Air Force. However, it shaped the Imperial Japanese Navy to conduct operations during the night. Those air operations were enough to tip the balance in the favour of the US Navy. The naval campaign was still a near-run thing, and the cost to the United States Navy was very heavy indeed. It's one thing to correctly identify the decisive terrain. Vandegrift did that. He also was able to seize the decisive terrain. Holding it would be a lot more difficult because for an airbase to operate, he was going to need to clear the Japanese soldiers from outside of artillery range. That's a lot of terrain. He doesn't have a lot of troops. He's in a logistically constrained environment. So we see him coming up with a novel approach to defending Henderson Field. This is an important point because he is fighting an enemy that will punish relentlessly any gaps that they can find in the perimeter. Lastly, from the point of Kawaguchi, he is getting a stark reminder of the difficulty of conducting operations in the jungle environment. He's struggling to maintain communications between his maneuver elements. Not only that, they are struggling to maneuver in the jungle. It's taking longer than he had planned for. He is hoping to synchronize and orchestrate effects. He's trying to get all of his troops together at one time in one spot so that they can generate overwhelming combat power at a time and place of his choosing. And the jungle is not going to help him do that at all. So a lot to think about with the preparation for the Battle of Bloody Ridge. And next week we're going to go into how the battle unfolded.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.